and there might be a couple more who pop in as the hour continues, but we'll go ahead and get started. We'd like to thank Louis Ziegler for recording this for us. We're recording it because there are some people who can't make it live, but they would like to watch it. Please remember that it is confidential information, that Dr. Williams is here, and so just being mindful of that and not sharing information about the visit. So we'd like to welcome Dr. Rachel Williams here, and we have until 11 o'clock for her presentation. We asked her to do about 30-40-minute presentation. There will be time for full questions about her presentation afterward. And then later today, we have time for the doctoral students. So this is Eve, who is one of our doctoral students, who is, and so we'll be able to meet up at the afternoon one as well, and hopefully some other doc students as well. And then the faculty will have an opportunity from 2 to 3, right? Is that it? To meet up to ask more questions, and you can ask questions of the faculty at that point, I think. So, and then the staff will be from 3 to 4, I think, or 3:30 to 4:30, I don't know. We'll look at this again. But, and so you'll get a chance to be up with staff as well. Okay. So, without further ado, I will turn the time over to Dr. Williams.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. So, thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Dr. Rachel Williams. I'm currently working as a faculty member at Simmons University School of Library Science. I'm really excited to be here today. First off, I just want to say thank you to all of you for taking the time to be here, especially with finals and graduation. I know it is a busy time for all of us, so I really appreciate you taking the time. So today I'm going to talk about my research, which is really centered on supporting patrons, promoting practitioners, examining the possibilities in public library services for patrons in crisis. So first off, I want to talk a little bit about my approach to scholarship, which is really situated between an interpretivist and a pragmatic approach. I'm very interested in understanding and the value of understanding phenomena, but I'm also interested in the practical value of actionable knowledge. As a result, my work is rooted in the belief that theory, research, and practice go hand in hand. I see those as very much interconnected, and my work is committed to those values, as well as conducting research that has practical value for public libraries, library staff, communities, and for LIS education as well. Generally speaking, I'm interested in questions around public libraries and librarianship, and this is a visual representation of my current research agenda, and all of my interests and projects kind of fall under this umbrella in a couple of different facets. So on the left here is my interest in library services for patrons in crisis, looking particularly at roles and responsibilities, well-being, trauma-informed community development, trauma-informed librarianship, and the role of community partnerships and collaboration. On the education and training side of things, I'm interested in professional development, LIS education, and the role of emerging technology in those arenas. So in the next few slides, what I'll do is go through some of my prior foundational work, some recent projects that I've engaged with, and then I'll discuss some current and future projects, again, that all kind of align with this overall research agenda. So to start out, my foundational research was really centered on looking at how public library staff perform boundary work when they're providing health and social services information to people experiencing homelessness, and particularly what the implications of that are in a professional, when it comes to considering what a profession of public librarianship entails. So why these questions? Why was I interested in these questions at the time? First of all, I worked at a small public library in Washington State for a few years, and one thing that stood out to me was that we didn't really have great solutions or supports for people who were experiencing crises, particularly unhoused patrons. Our solution was often to get that person a bus ticket to the next largest town, which was about an hour and a half away, but we didn't really have anything in place to support those patrons. And so that kind of stayed in the back of my mind for a while, and it also got me to start thinking about some of the changes in the profession, what that looked like around library services for unhoused patrons, and really what should the responsibility of public library professionals be when it comes to supporting those patrons and others that were experiencing a variety of other crises as well. There were also some pivotal moments in our profession. First off, Richard Kramer's lawsuit. This man filed a lawsuit against the city of Morristown, New Jersey, essentially because he got kicked out of the library because of his body odor. And what came out of that is that there's this idea that library policy could not condition access on distinctions between patrons. Also, public libraries and their staff at this time really became more interested in how to better provide information services to unhoused patrons, which led to the development of some policies, like the ALA Policy 61, library services for the poor. And then more recently, work around vocational law, this idea that the profession of public librarianship is sacred and that we should do everything at all costs without really considering our own well-being is something that has been in the back of my mind as well. Additionally, some of my foundational work relied on boundary work theory, which refers to activities that involve creating, negotiating, reinforcing, and crossing boundaries between abstract fields of knowledge. It really asks this question, what is a profession, what isn't it? Thomas Guerin in 1983 describes what constitutes science and what science is not. He uses descriptions of science and science is not X or Y to demonstrate the ways in which boundaries are created to delineate what a domain of knowledge is and what it isn't. He also argues that threats to the professions are essentially struggles over boundaries, which are often rooted in conflicting or involving ideological issues. So it really came down to this process of demarcating professions, articulating what kind of ownership actors have over their professions, what kind of autonomy, how people legitimize the work that they do. And so when we think about this in the context of public librarianship has been and continues to be a profession that's in flux, right? So public librarians and library staff are constantly doing this negotiating work, developing boundaries, re-articulating boundaries in response to some of the larger cultural and political things that are happening around them in their communities. And so it's this dynamic process of negotiation. It can be influenced by a lot of different factors, including one's own personal boundaries, their own experiences of trauma, the empathy that they have for patrons and other staff that they're working with, perceptions of privacy, is it even okay to ask someone if they're going through something, and then perceptions of professional responsibility. So all this stuff aside, what do I think I should do, and is that the thing that I'm actually going to do? So in terms of methods for this foundational project, it was a qualitative study where I interviewed 24 staff at 3 public library systems. There were 3 suburban library systems where populations ranged from about 84,000 to approximately 300,000. There were also varying populations of people experiencing homelessness, so both in terms of the number of people experiencing homelessness in those communities, as well as the kinds of homelessness that folks were dealing with. So in one of the library systems, there was a large population of veterans who were unhoused, and then in another community, there were a lot of youth that were unhoused, for example. I interviewed managers, librarians, and paraprofessionals, again, all around this question of managing professional boundaries when providing health and social services information to these patrons. So in terms of this project, I just want to highlight a couple of things and then connect it to more recent scholarship that I've performed. So a few highlights include, number one, library staff want to help, but they didn't know how. They didn't know what the best way to help those patrons was. Additionally, empathy was central to the work that library staff were doing, but it also made boundaries really difficult to maintain. So in some instances, library staff were completely avoiding someone that they thought was experiencing homelessness, and then in other cases, they were taking them home, letting them sleep on the couch. And in both of those extremes, they're like, I don't think this is what I was supposed to do, but it was the thing that I felt like I should have done in that moment. And so really, these questions about boundaries and the ways that people articulated them based on some of those factors that I mentioned in the preceding slide, was really, really central to the ways in which they were providing these information services to unhoused patrons. Additionally, and unsurprisingly, library staff also pointed to connections and tensions between social work and librarianship. So when we think about those conflicts over professional roles and responsibilities, that boundary work, there are both opportunities for collaboration and a need to really articulate and disentangle some of those blurred lines between social work and public librarianship. So all of those highlights really inform some of my more recent work, which has looked at ways in which social work informs public library practice, a consideration of people experiencing crises more broadly, particularly in the last few years, and then the impact of crises and trauma on library staff. And so just to highlight, I'm sure we're familiar with a lot of the ways in which public libraries do continue to support patrons and communities in crisis, but the past few years have really highlighted many different areas in which public libraries and their communities are struggling. So as a response to that, libraries are responding, right? So or they're supporting those patrons in a variety of ways, including things like overdose prevention and training, choosing harm reduction practices, peer outreach programs. So this photo is, I'm sorry, the image is a little bit small, or the image is a little small, is of Renee Hines, who is a peer specialist for DC Public Library. Also just an increased focus on health and well-being of both library staff and library patrons, developing communication and de-escalation training. So many public libraries and their staff have gone through sort of basic psychological or mental health first aid training. But essentially, public libraries are doing a lot, right? So they're supporting patrons through difficult personal situations, everything from mental health crises to dealing with being unhoused or being housing insecure, substance use, domestic violence, and then at a community level, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted a lot of communities and public libraries, as well as natural disasters, community violence, racism. These are all issues that public libraries are dealing with on a daily basis, and they're doing a lot to support patrons. So all that stuff really inspired my recent scholarship, which looked at a couple of questions related to the scope of public library work, as well as the challenges and barriers that public library staff deal with when they are supporting people in crisis, as well as this question, again, coming out of my foundational work, looking at whether and how there are ways in which social work can inform library practice, particularly regarding knowledge, attitudes, and skill development. So this is a more recent project called Meeting the Needs of People in Crisis at the Boston Public Library, which was a collaborative project with a social work faculty member at Simmons University that was funded by the National Network of the Libraries of Medicine, New England Region Community Engagement Grant. So to dig into the methods for this project a little bit further, this was a two-part mixed methods study that involved both focus groups with public library workers and a workshop series with public library staff. So the focus groups took place across 5 different instances at a variety of branches in the Boston Public Library system. So if you're familiar with Boston, there's the kind of downtown central branch, and then there are all these neighborhood branches interspersed throughout the Boston area. So the goal there was to connect with library staff that were working in the branches, as well as staff that worked at the central location. But essentially we were asking about the experiences that library staff have had with people in crisis, things that they wish they knew more about, the scope and nature of public library work when it came to supporting people in crisis, and how that impacted other work responsibilities that staff had. The participants were predominantly white and female. They had experience ranging from 1 year to over 30 years of experience working in public libraries. And the positions that staff held ranged from paraprofessional roles such as library assistants to managerial ones like branch managers. The second component of the project was the workshop series that came out of topics that were identified in the focus group study. So the topics included resilience and self-care, supporting healthy boundaries in public library work, and interacting with and supporting people in crisis with a focus on mental illness. So just to share a few findings from this study, if you're interested in the publication, it's over here on the left. But these focus groups really showed that library workers, of course, like I mentioned from my foundational work, they want to help people that are experiencing crises, and they do feel empathy for the crises that patrons are going through. They also want to be fair. They want to display an egalitarian mindset and serve everyone equally well, although they felt like they were pulled in multiple directions based on having to respond to this person that's having an overdose in the library, but also they're supposed to be running a program, and they're trying to navigate all of that, oftentimes as, you know, the only person in that branch or one of two people in the branch, right? Additionally, library staff, despite wanting to do this work, faced a lot of barriers to helping. So first off, they did want training. They wanted additional training that was specific to public library work, so not just here's how to do some customer service, but here's what customer service looks like in a library when you're being pulled in all these directions. They wanted to be able to say the right thing, but didn't always have the knowledge or skills to be able to do so. They were also concerned about safety, both in terms of experiencing racism, you know, weapons in the library, being the only person on staff at closing time. They felt vulnerable in a lot of situations. You know, they kind of knew sometimes patrons that they had had negative interactions with in the past. They were worried about being confronted or being manipulated if they had helped someone in the past. And they just lacked confidence in some cases. They also deal with this issue of role diffusion, where they felt like they had to kind of police the library and manage everything. I mentioned dealing with overdoses. Sometimes, you know, dealing with issues of daycare or people dropping their kids off at the library. And then also mental health, both for patrons and for themselves. So as a result, we did conduct a series of workshops on some topics that library staff wanted more training on, and at least a space to talk about. So those topics were, as I mentioned earlier, were resilience and self-care, supporting healthy boundaries, and interacting with and supporting people in crisis. So again, really looking at the ways in which we could build skills in a way that worked for public library staff. Ultimately, as we found in this publication, this part of our research, staff did have increased confidence, knowledge, and were able to develop strategies to implement in the areas for the training. They developed some strategies for self-care, although in some cases they already had a lot of those strategies, so it was sort of helpful for them to articulate those strategies and then share them with each other. They also felt like they could assert boundaries more effectively, but provided some suggestions for some additional training opportunities, including a need for repeated and more in-depth training, so there's only so much you can cover in an hour and a half to 2 hours. They also wanted trainings that was centered on physical boundaries and safety, which has become even more important for public library work lately, and then mindfulness and assertiveness training as well. So in addition to that recent project, I have a few sort of tangential or additional projects that have come out of my interest in these areas, including a focus on social work, public library collaborations, and service models. So kind of getting a sense of the landscape with that, which will be published in a book chapter that I believe is coming out later this year, as well as an encyclopedia entry. Additionally, another area that came out of this work was the importance of trauma-informed practice and community development, and consideration of that, particularly for considering the trauma that library staff deal with and acknowledging that actively and in a way that supports those staff when they're helping patrons that are going through trauma as well. And then finally, partnering with libraries and state library systems to develop professional development. So this has been really great because it's kept me more connected to librarianship, and I've been able to partner with folks in New England, so with the Massachusetts Library System, and the Empire State Library Network in New York to facilitate some programming and webinars, workshops, whatever you want to call it, on mental health and de-escalation, developing healthy boundaries, and self-care and resilience building through what's called a PERMA theory of well-being, which really is centered on finding meaning, essentially positive emotion, engagement, building strong relationships, finding meaning, achievement, healthy practices, all these different facets and practices in your life that can help support your well-being and give you the resilience to be able to bounce back if you do have a difficult experience. You're able to continue moving forward afterward. Okay. So, that was a little bit about my foundational work and my recent scholarship, which really leads up to my current project. And for me, what's really come to the fore from my recent project in particular is that library staff face a lot of difficulties when it comes to balancing the needs of library patrons with taking care of themselves. And so a really important component of that is finding ways to bolster training for library staff so that they feel empowered to support patrons in crisis, both effectively and confidently, because that really supports library workers' ability to articulate what the scope of their work is, right? If they feel empowered, if they feel comfortable, they can say like, this is the thing that we're going to do. We're going to take ownership of that. We're going to let this other stuff go, or we're going to find a community partner that can really help balance out our work. So additionally, from the previous workshops that I facilitated, one thing that came out was that staff, they want more. They wanted more opportunities to practice and engage with concepts related to crisis management, related to self-care, and they wanted more chance to work through that training, through scenarios that we had developed. So, and I, getting a little creative, I was like, oh, maybe we can use virtual reality, see how that goes. So, decided to pursue that. Social work as a field has already implemented some virtual reality training over the past, really about the past decade. So it seems kind of like a natural extension of that approach and kind of help bolster my interest. Like, okay, there's some adjacent fields doing this, pre-service teacher education as well. So so I became interested in this topic and this question, which I won't read to you because it's very long, but yeah. All right. So, to start out with this current project, I and my colleagues conducted a literature review and an initial smaller study to get a feel for how this training might work. I have to admit, I was a little bit skeptical at first. I was like, I don't know, I have this idea, it may or may not work, but, why not give it a try, right? So, really, we were concerned with these questions. Is VR training for crisis management work? What's the usability? What does that look like? Are students engaged? Does the training help build skills among students? And if they go through this training in a virtual environment, can they successfully de-escalate an interaction after they go through the training? So, taking a look at that. This is an image of the virtual environment that we created. So, we've got like a circulation desk. We have some patrons wandering around. They're at the computer stations there. So just to give you a little snapshot of what that looks like. So for this initial study, we conducted a mixed method study that was comprised of both the usability component and an evaluative component. So the evaluation component included the pre and post session questionnaires that I actually used in the in-person and Zoom-based trainings that I had done with library staff with the Massachusetts library system and in New York. The exercises that were then implemented in virtual reality through this usability study with 10 graduate students. The participants sent a profile picture to the researchers 1 week before their sessions and created avatars using those photos in a tool called Ready Player Me. So here's my little avatar over there. It's pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good.
Yeah, it's all and then the day of the session, the participants, they did the informed consent stuff and they completed the pre-study questionnaires, which included both the usability component and the evaluation component. Did the session and then did the post-session questionnaire and a debrief. So that's a little bit about the process. The assessment tools that we used, the first of them was
a system usability scale, which has been around for quite some time, as well as some additional questions related to the VR technology, the immersiveness, comfort with wearing the headset, that kind of thing. The pre and post questionnaires measured we used an adapted scale on knowledge regarding mental illness, confidence and de-escalation, and empathy for patrons, which was based on Herrera et al., who did a comparative study of VR and traditional methods for building empathy in participants. And then we also conducted a structured observation of the participant-patron interaction. So me and another researcher and the third researcher kind of validated this checklist. We created a checklist based on the skills that were included in the training that students participated in, and looked for positive skills related to communication, empathy, and de-escalation, and then negative skills, particularly related to body language and communication. As you can imagine, in the virtual environment, if someone comes up to me and is having a crisis and I'm behind the circulation or the reference desk or the circulation desk, and I just kind of sit back here, I don't approach the patron, I don't, or I do approach the patron and I get in their face, you know, those kinds of things we were looking for with that interaction. So I want to share just a few key findings. Different components of this project, we submitted them for publication and presentation in a few different venues, but those are all in process. The cool thing is that the results are pretty promising and exciting, so my skepticism was wrong. But basically, in terms of the evaluation component of the project, folks really responded in a way that was similar to the in-person trainings that I've facilitated. They learned some effective methods for directly addressing patrons with mental illness. They felt like they could probably recognize signs of someone who was having a serious mental health issue. They were confident that they could implement strategies to de-escalate a situation with a patron. They also identified some de-escalation strategies that worked for them. And they felt like they gained important skills and confidence in working with patrons in crisis. So the confidence increase was particularly important there. In terms of demonstrating the skills in that interaction, go back. In terms of demonstrating skills during the interaction, almost all of them, 9 out of 10, demonstrated an ability to identify options with the patron and to let that patron choose for themselves, so really supporting the autonomy of the patron in crisis, which is important for de-escalation. They offered to call a family member, to move to a different area, suggested options like sitting down in a little seating area, taking a breath, a variety of different choices for that patron. The participants did struggle a little bit with validating the patron's feelings. A little under half of them were able to do that by saying something like, "Oh, that sounds very distressing." So not necessarily encouraging the escalation, but validating their feelings in that moment. And then 3 of the participants did display some negative behaviors related to personal space, so getting a little too close, which could have been a result of the VR headset. Communicating with inflammatory language, telling the patron to calm down, which if anyone tells me to calm down, it's not going to go well. So those were definitely some areas that I think pointed to potential ways that we might reconsider some of the training for the future. And then in terms of the usability findings, many, or I guess most of the participants did enjoy the VR experience. They felt like the headset was comfortable. They felt a sense of presence or immersion in the virtual environment, which was good. Almost all of them thought the training would be useful in LAS graduate courses. So one participant commented that it was a great way to prepare students for situations that they'll most likely be in if working in a public library setting. Teaching students to effectively communicate with patrons in all situations should be a greater focus in the MLS curriculum. Another one mentioned scaffolding of skills without consequences, so you can make mistakes, try different things and see how they work out. And then another person mentioned how extremely stressful and potentially dangerous it could be to have a patron or to have library staff members acquire experience through engaging with real life in real life scenarios. So it really provided this kind of low stakes environment for people to practice skills, to make mistakes, and then debrief about it afterwards. What we learned is that we need longer, more in-depth scenarios, and a variety of scenarios as well. Okay, so to kind of grow this initial study, we're focusing on two current projects, one of which is centered on LIS graduate student education, and another which is centered more on public library workers. So as I mentioned, we're building out longer scenarios with a patron who is experiencing a mental health crisis. We're also developing boundary setting scenarios, which was based on a two-part webinar that I facilitated on boundary setting in libraries. So with that webinar, I had a variety of scenarios, everything from book challenges to a patron wanting to date the reference librarian, so those kinds of scenarios, building those out so that students and library staff can engage with them in the virtual environment. And then finally, also the reference interviews. So, thinking about ways that, students and library staff could practice the reference interview in a virtual environment, or even thinking about user instruction as well. So with these projects, really looking at these key questions. So first off, the implementation of VR training. Second of all, is it effective? We've seen some sort of initial signs that it is, but we need to do more research in this area. Does it build confidence? Does it build empathy? Particularly thinking about long-term empathy, I think is also important, something to consider. Third off, thinking about cognitive load, and how does that have implications for both LIS education and professional development, and then the usability of VR, generally speaking. So those are the areas that these two projects are looking at. And then in terms of funding for the two projects, on the left here is an IMLS grant that we should hear about in July. And then on the right here is a Spencer Foundation grant, which they take about a year to get back to you. So it's going to be probably January before I hear back about that. So one of these is looking more at the professional, public library worker side, and the other one is looking at the LIS education side of things. Sorry about that. Okay, so in terms of my future projects, they're really centered on a couple different areas. So, thinking about the graphic I showed you at the outset, interested in education. Right now, VR is a big component of my current research interest. And then on the flip side of that, also interested in continuing to consider library services for people in crisis, particularly public librarianship and social work, those intersections. So for my VR projects right now, some other educational contexts that I think could be really interesting and valuable to consider would be issues of safety in the library. So managing space, threatening patrons, considering safety in a variety of different ways, because that is something that library staff pointed to, but it's also something that we often approach from a very kind of white-centric perspective, so challenging that a little bit, or a lot. Challenges to intellectual freedom, so book banning, people protesting, story times in the library, and then overdose prevention training, which does already exist in a VR form, so finding organizations to partner with and connecting potentially to the public library here, Richmond Public Library, an organization that provides this kind of training, and developing or co-designing some VR training around that. And then VR and patron engagement. I was really excited about this project, VRtality, which is out of Seattle Public Library, University of Washington, and a couple other folks that looks at co-designed mental health VR support that's co-designed by teams and libraries. And then I'm also interested in VR accessibility and public library programming, particularly because VR both in some ways makes programming more accessible, but it also introduces some accessibility issues as well. So lots there. And then in terms of my future projects related to public library practice, library services for people in crisis, social work. I want to continue my interest in social work informed library practice, so looking at trauma-informed librarianship and community development. So I heard there's a doc student interested in that, which is really exciting. You know, thinking, and there's also a certificate, an ICAR certificate in that? Which is also really great to hear. So definitely some connections there. Self-care, resilience development, thinking about what a sustainable community looks like with public libraries as those anchor institutions that they are. I'd also like to return to boundary work and identity among public library workers, and then collaboration and community engagement. So thinking particularly about the skills that public library staff bring. Say, you know, they are a second career librarian. What does their approach to collaboration look like as compared to someone right out of library school? And how do people work that out, right? What does collaboration look like? So ultimately, my work has been and it will continue to be centered on public libraries with an emphasis on engaging with issues related to supporting people in crisis. I'm very much committed to scholarship that has practical value, specifically research that emphasizes both supporting patrons and promoting practitioners as members of the public library community. And so in doing so, I plan to continue weaving in relevant concepts and theories from social work, education, and adopting technologies like virtual reality as tools, not solutions, but as tools that increase the capacity for innovation in both research and teaching in these areas. So again, thank you so much for your time today. And at this point, I would be delighted to take any questions you have. So, thank you very much. Okay.
Do you have any questions?
I have a comment. So I had a colleague previously something who was doing virtual reality for bullying scenarios.
Oh, wow, okay.
And so I got to try it out with that. And
Yeah.
it's true, it makes a difference
Yeah.
when you're thinking or hearing what you're supposed to say versus
Yeah.
then getting to try it out.
Yeah.
Like, and even if you're a little intimidated to do it like a role play with a person,
Mm-hmm.
it just kind of lessens that anxiety. But it feels different than just reading about it.
It does,
To
yeah.
actually do it with a thing. So it's really,
Yeah.
it's really cool.
Yeah, there's definitely this sense of embodiment. And one thing I didn't mention with the current tech that we're using for this project is the hands are kind of disembodied from the head, which is a little weird, but you are navigating space, you are interacting, you are immersed. And even with some of the in-person and Zoom-based trainings that I've done with library staff, they interact very differently, or they have a very brief interaction and they, passively talk about the scenario rather than engaging with it the same way that you're forced to when you are immersed in the environment. Yeah. Yes.
So I wanted to know more about what your percentage is fascinating, great, and how has that fed or how has that changed your approach to teaching? Because there's so many connections here. I'm literally.
Yes.
When you said like the countdown thing, I'm like, how many times did you repeat that in reference? It's like never in the history of countdown has anyone calmed down by just being told to do so.
Yeah. So it has impacted my teaching a lot. So I would say that, thinking about just being forced to think about all the issues that public libraries are dealing with all the time reminds me that that's something I should talk to my students about. And so in my public libraries class, for example, we have a week on health and wellness where students, develop a self-care plan. They talk about well-being. They talk about struggles related to boundaries. So we work together so that they can develop plans for themselves and the work that they do. I also very much believe that students have their own experiences and expertise to bring to the classroom, and so I certainly welcome that. A lot of students are working in libraries, and if they have an example that's relevant, then let's talk about it. Let's use that to pull out whatever theories or projects we're talking about, that kind of thing. With the VR stuff, for my public libraries class, I did have students, go through the VR training, so they really enjoyed that. They felt like it gave them the opportunity, again, to engage in a bit more of an immersive way. And then just being more trauma-informed myself, that's something I'm trying to work on, is that recognizing that, so my trauma, their trauma, sometimes they interact in difficult ways, and so that's something that I need to acknowledge in my own work, and that I'm very open about with my students. So, does that answer your question?
Actually, Florida State, we have Anna Long is on faculty at Florida State. She has been working with the huge social work consortia
Oh, great.
to build some training for librarians for the awareness about the and about the opioid crisis.
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
is an education workbook.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's Dr. Margaret Zimmerman.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, Margaret Sullivan, Margaret Zimmerman, and I don't know how she's something else.
Okay.
Yeah, so you might wanted to contact with Margaret.
Yeah,
and
that's
maybe
great.
Your research can be integrated into
Yeah.
her part.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
That would be great.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for the recommendation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about what your research might look like if you were to extend this sort of training into intellectual freedom issues? I know that you mentioned it as a bullet. Yeah.
Yeah. So right now I'm thinking primarily around scenarios that I did with the boundary setting workshop, where patrons are coming in and challenging materials to library staff, how to respond to that. One thing that came out of that workshop was that even when library staff did have solid collection development policies, they knew what they were supposed to do. And the moment they're like, I don't know where, we don't have copies of the policy on hand, or I haven't dealt with this in a while, I don't really know what I'm doing, or I'm a new staff member. So really modeling it more after those in the moment kind of scenarios. I would love to collaborate with someone who has more expertise in that area, which I feel like you do. So
I don't know about that, but yeah.
yeah.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And I think that it would be interesting, like, for our students, because, when they go into libraries now, it's like, the cops are getting called because
Yeah.
there's pornography on the shelf. So how do you deal with that sort of
Exactly.
situation that's hard to kind of just, like, lecture away in
Yes.
class?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly.
First, thank you for a great presentation. As I was listening to you, I was reminded of a comment student made in my class.
Okay.
I think she was actually a private public librarian, and she mentioned that one of the biggest frustrations for her was the sense that as librarians, they feel like they're dealing with symptoms rather than the cause, and the sense of helplessness.
Yeah.
So homeless person showing up in the library,
Yep.
they can deal with some of the issues they usually see, but this person is going to keep calm.
Yep.
Same thing with addiction, right? Or overdose.
Yeah.
I mean, to what extent are these sentiments part of your research? The sense that you can only deal with the symptoms, but not the larger issues.
Yeah.
These people are faced with, and if they are not, is this something that you consider going
Yeah.
forward?
Yeah, so it's definitely something that tangentially has come up often in my work, and it's not something that I've addressed outright, but I think part of that has to do with the nature of public libraries and librarianship, when you think about it from the sense of it as a profession, right? We have a long history in public libraries of sort of responding to what's happening in communities rather than taking ownership and articulating what we will do and what we won't do. And so I think that, particularly thinking about that article on vocational awe and, us, at least over the past 2 years, starting to acknowledge, we're doing a lot of stuff that's maybe not stuff that we should be doing or have the capacity to do, have the training to do, have the desire to do. And so how do we develop not just individual skills to respond, but also develop, policies and infrastructure that allows us to take ownership of what we will do. And I think it's going to be a continual tension. I don't know that It's something we'll be able to resolve immediately, but I do think the reason we're seeing a lot of social work library partnerships, additional partnerships, community health partnerships, is because of these kinds of prevailing issues and realizing that, okay, well, we don't have to own this piece. We can partner with someone and develop infrastructure that actually supports that partnership for the long term in order to mitigate that. But it's going to be a long tension there.
Anything with focus groups or talking with individuals, do you find that any of the librarians are themselves experiencing their own mental health challenges, particularly anxiety, and how that might affect their interactions with in these challenging situations?
Yeah, a lot of them are experiencing mental health concerns, anxiety, or had family members that were dealing with addiction, for example. And so anytime they interacted with a patron, that trauma is coming up for them, and so they're trying to navigate both their own personal trauma and the experience that patron is having. So it came up a lot. It really did.
I know you mentioned that our school is a good fit for you in terms of this work. Can you talk a little bit more about that? The environment?
In terms of, sorry.
You say that you are excited to come here because you think it's a good fit between your work and the school. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the program itself, I see a lot of potential connections with faculty. So I think that there's some areas in which both my VR project and my interest in trauma-informed librarianship seem to be a good fit. I think we were talking about this earlier. There's a faculty member in journalism that focuses on crisis communication, so that might be another great person to connect with. Obviously, Faylee, love your work. I taught a crisis management and rapid response class last year, and we focused in part on natural disasters, and then also in part on individual level crises. And so certainly I think there are connections there as well. Additionally, it seems like the University of South Carolina has some good connections with a lot of public libraries in the area. Obviously Richland Public Library and the connection to social work there, fantastic. I also heard about Columbia Public Library and some of the professional development or professional certificates. So I see some possibilities there. And just having a connection to the state university system, I think there's a lot of potential there. So, right now I work with, more urban public library workers, but I see a lot of challenges in more suburban and rural areas too. And so I think that being able to tap into that in this region is very, very appealing. Great.
I have a comment.
Okay.
So in my non-academic life, I work sometimes with people in the community who are, so I think would benefit greatly from speaking with a social worker at the local library.
Yeah.
I have suggested that,
Yeah.
and 100% of the time, they are not interested in talking to a social worker. This past week, I was talking with somebody else who said, maybe you don't call them a social worker, call them a financial expert or a housing expert or whatever, and then say, okay, here's their contact, just so you know they're called a social worker, but this is their expertise. Have you had any talk about that, or do you teach anything about that?
So I don't, but I guess my thought here is that, anytime someone's like, oh, maybe go do this, right? Like if you're confronted with it directly, sometimes people are like, oh, no. It's also a situation where maybe that person feels really vulnerable, and so the thought of going to capital S, capital worker, social worker can be difficult. So, I think reframing it is a great way to make it a little bit less scary for people. And then also just, some of the social work library partnerships that I've looked at involve, having people just kind of hanging out at a desk or hanging out in a private office. So, ensuring that, people have that privacy when they're talking to someone can also make them feel a little bit less vulnerable. yeah, it's tricky. People respond in different ways. Yeah.
But I see what you mean about, because that they are trained in all those things
Yeah.
that librarians, we don't train people how to help with addiction, how to help with houselessness and all that. They are experts, and they're sitting right there.
Right.
And we do have, I think we have 4 social workers in our library.
Yeah.
People are, they have appointments, they do these things, everything, often we invite people to come.
Yeah, and I think the more that is normalized, that's partly why, like, I'm willing to talk about my trauma with my students sometimes, is like, they, that normalizes it for them. It's fine to seek help if you need it,
I have a question. So you talked about the voluntary work theory. I was also working on like a small project to think about what to make librarianship become a profession. And we had like a movement in last century to professionalize our field. So one of the approach is to try to take more and more responsibilities.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, how do you think, where's the boundary between library work and other kind of like social work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, it's my confused when I read the paper.
Yeah, that's partly why I want to return to that question, is because, it's much easier when we look at some of the hard science professions that very clearly have ways of articulating and legitimizing what they do. But, for us, public librarianship really is intersects with a lot of different areas. And so it is this like struggle to decide, like, this is what makes us a legitimate quote unquote profession. And you can see that some with, increasing educational requirements in the field, the ALA Code of Ethics even, all these things are designed to kind of legitimize the work that we're doing in a variety of ways. But unfortunately, we are also still responding to all these things happening. We're constantly taking on more and more because of this, sense of vocational awe, really. And that's why there's so much tension there in the profession. Yeah. But it's a great question. Yeah, love to work with it on you. Work on it with you. Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah.
This period last week I was at the local library and it was beautiful, and it had like this big beautiful screen, it had a recording studio, it had lots of the similar things that we have here. And I was thinking the same thing, I was like, so now our librarians now film artists, studio, like all this stuff.
Yeah, right.
Or do you hire somebody who doesn't have an MLIS, maybe who does that, in which case then that's an interesting dance as well.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Marnita, do you have any questions?
No. But thank you for your great presentation. Hi. Hi.
another doctoral student?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd love to end with what's next?
What's next?
I saw your grants. Those take forever.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Yeah.
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
So where do you want to take these?
Yeah, so right now, we are currently taking those scenarios that I worked through with my webinar and kind of fleshing those out into scenarios that can be used in the virtual environment while waiting to hear back on the grants. And then definitely, depending on how long that takes, returning to the boundary work stuff. And my, sort of my more recent project with the social work faculty member, we have more to do with boundary work there too. So mostly kind of taking on some of these smaller projects, working on the encyclopedia entry while waiting to hear back on the grant, which hopefully,